Revolution in the Valley, the insanely great story of how the Mac was made by Andy Hertzfeld and Steve Capps. In the summer of 1979, the Macintosh began not as a revolutionary graphical computer, but as a modest research project initiated by Jef Raskin, a former university professor with a slight stammer and a playful management style. Raskin envisioned a brutally simple, ultra-low-cost appliance computer. He moved his tiny team into an office littered with Nerf balls and model airplanes, outlining his vision in a manifesto called the Book of Macintosh. Raskin's original design relied on a weak 689 microprocessor and actively avoided the use of a mouse. However, the trajectory of the project changed forever with the arrival of Burrell Smith, a young, animated, and slightly nervous hardware genius with long, straight blonde hair. Burrell possessed a quirky demeanor, frequently mixing technical jargon with baby talk and offering temporary best friendship as a reward for favors. Initially a lowly service technician, Burrell possessed a profound empathy for elegant hardware design. Encouraged by software programmers Bud Tribble and Bill Atkinson, Burrell surreptitiously designed a prototype utilizing the powerful Motorola 68000 processor, implementing a brilliant bus transformer hack that delivered massive processing power at a fraction of the expected cost. When Steve Jobs, Apple's charismatic and relentlessly demanding co-founder, caught wind of Burrell's design, he recognized its potential to blow away Apple's expensive, sluggish Lisa project. In early 1981, Jobs seized control of the Macintosh team, unceremoniously forcing Raskin into a leave of absence. Steve moved the small, rebellious team into a modest, wood-paneled office building behind a gas station, affectionately dubbed Texaco Towers. Corporate executives attempted to rename the project Bicycle, arguing that computers were bicycles for the mind, but the rebellious engineers steadfastly refused to call it anything but Macintosh. Here, Steve infused the team with a messianic fervor. He possessed an indomitable will and a rhetorical style that generated a reality distortion field, a confounding aura that could bend facts and convince anyone of practically anything. Under Steve's leadership, the Macintosh transitioned from a promising research novelty into a world-changing commercial crusade. Steve insisted that the Macintosh team were not merely engineers, but artists, and their work needed to reflect the classic, timeless lines of a Porsche. This artistic drive extended to everything. Jerry Manock, leading the industrial design, crafted an unconventional, upright plastic case to minimize the computer's footprint on a desk. Steve was relentlessly critical, iterating through plaster models until the chamfers and curves were perfect. He even demanded that the internal printed circuit board be laid out beautifully, arguing that a great carpenter wouldn't use lousy wood on the back of a cabinet, even if no one would ever see it. To cement this identity, Steve eventually had the entire team sign their names on a drafting sheet, engraving their signatures directly into the hard steel tooling of the Macintosh case, so that every unit shipped would carry the hidden marks of its creators. As the hardware solidified, the software team worked miracles to fit a sprawling graphical user interface into a tiny, heavily constrained amount of memory. Bill Atkinson, a brilliant, dedicated programmer and avid photographer, created QuickDraw, the lightning-fast graphics engine that allowed for overlapping windows and the beautifully rounded rectangles that Steve Jobs demanded. Bill also developed Mac Paint, ingeniously solving the problem of visual selection on black and white screens by creating an animated, shimmering border that he affectionately dubbed Marching Ants. Bruce Horn, a tall, idealistic, and uncompromising programmer recruited from Xerox PARC, championed the Resource Manager and the Finder, enabling the Mac's revolutionary drag-and-drop spatial file system. The team operated as a flat meritocracy, completely dedicated to their craft. Susan Kare, a whimsical bitmap graphic designer, crafted the system's elegant proportional fonts and iconic imagery. When Steve Jobs complained that there were too many Apple logos used for keyboard shortcuts, Susan leafed through an international symbol dictionary and found a floral symbol used in Sweden to indicate campground attractions, a symbol that remains on Mac keyboards decades later. She even took time to draw a tiny, mischievous portrait of Steve Jobs pixel by pixel. Steve Capps, a stockily built, easygoing programmer with long brown hair, a bushy beard, and signature checkered sneakers, brought fresh energy to the group, porting a 3D chess game called Alice, and stepping in to assist Bruce in the frantic high-pressure push to finish the finder. Despite their egalitarian ideals, the intense pressure occasionally fractured the team. Bill Atkinson was heartbroken when computer magazines credited middle managers for the interface design. Haunted by a past experience where an academic professor stole credit for his groundbreaking 3D brain animations, Bill cornered Steve Jobs and threatened to quit. Though initially dismissive of the complaint, Steve ultimately appeased Bill by appointing him as an Apple Fellow, the highest technical honor at the company, and ensuring that the true engineers' names were permanently enshrined in the software's About box and celebrated during the launch. The team worked tirelessly, fueled by an atmosphere of spontaneous, irreverent humor. They implemented desk accessories that allowed small programs, such as a calculator or a sliding puzzle, to run concurrently with main applications. They delighted in creating incredibly fast disk routines and clever Easter eggs. Anticipating that clone manufacturers might try to steal their code, the team secretly compressed a stolen from Apple icon featuring prison bars deep within the immutable ROM chips. It was designed to pop up on a competitor's machine during a courtroom demonstration, a stealthy testament to their foresight. Their confidence occasionally bordered on arrogance, when industry pundit Adam Osborne arrogantly boasted at a computer fair that his portable Osborne 1 computer would outsell Apple. Steve Jobs famously called Osborne's office and left a message telling him he was an asshole, promising that the Macintosh would be so good it would put Osborne out of business. But as the project scaled and the team moved to larger facilities on the main campus, the pirate-like spirit of the early team clashed with the growing corporate bureaucracy. When Bob Belleville, an older, soft-spoken, and pragmatic engineer with a dry skepticism toward human nature, was hired as the engineering manager, tensions erupted. Bob viewed the rebellious software team as unmanageable and insubordinate, leading to bitter confrontations where he gave out harsh performance reviews and even threatened to fire essential engineers. The team felt their creative sanctuary was being dismantled. Despite Steve Jobs' promises to protect their artistic freedom, the looming pressure of the January 1984 shipping deadline forced the engineers to endure the strict management structure. Technical crises mounted alongside the interpersonal drama. The custom Twiggy floppy disk drive built by Apple's disk division was failing spectacularly, suffering from horrific error rates that threatened to derail the entire Macintosh launch. In a risky, covert operation defying Steve Jobs' explicit orders to build a drive in-house, Bob Belleville and analog engineer George Crow secretly collaborated with Sony to adapt their superior 3.5-inch microfloppy drive. During one tense moment, they even had to hide a visiting Sony engineer in a janitorial closet to prevent Steve from discovering their clandestine backup plan. When the in-house drive effort predictably failed, Steve swallowed his pride and accepted the Sony drive, saving the Macintosh from disaster. In the fall of 1983, the team famously hoisted a custom black pirate flag featuring a skull and crossbones with a rainbow Apple eye patch over their building to declare their defiant identity. But the push to finish the software became a grueling, sleepless marathon. Wearing gray sweatshirts that mocked Steve Jobs' boast to the press of working 90 hours a week and loving it, the engineers consumed massive amounts of chocolate-covered espresso beans, eliminating bugs in frantic coding sessions right up until the factory opened to burn the final ROM chips. They even scrambled to write a custom music player to blare the theme from Chariots of Fire for the launch, only to have Steve reject it as too primitive, opting for a CD instead. They barely met the deadline, submitting the final software disk at 6 in the morning, just a week before the launch, stumbling out into the daylight in a sleep-deprived daze. The culmination of this intense labor was Apple's 1984 annual shareholders meeting. The event was preceded by the airing of Ridley Scott's spectacular, dystopian 1984 commercial during the Super Bowl, which positioned Apple as the heroic rebel shattering IBM's totalitarian dominance. At the Flint Center, Steve Jobs took the stage dressed like a Las Vegas impresario in a sharp black suit and bow tie, He whipped the packed auditorium into a frenzy, quoting Bob Dylan and outlining the looming threat of IBM. The lights dimmed, the theme from Chariots of Fire swelled, and Steve unveiled the Macintosh from its canvas-carrying bag. He inserted a floppy disk, and large, beautifully rendered letters scrolled across the screen. Then, the machine spoke for itself in a synthesized, tremulous voice, famously declaring, "Never trust a computer that you can't lift." Pandemonium reigned, and the exhausted design team bathed in a 5-minute standing ovation, weeping with joy and relief. Even after the original team began to splinter, their technical prowess continued to shape the platform. When Andy Hertzfeld took a leave of absence, he independently developed a brilliant multitasking utility called Switcher. This caught the attention of Microsoft's Bill Gates, who attempted to lowball Andy into selling it cheaply by challenging his programming ego. Andy refused, instead selling it directly back to Apple for $100,000 to ensure it was bundled with every Mac. Yet, the writing was on the wall for Apple's competitive advantage. When Steve Jobs furiously confronted Bill Gates for ripping off the Mac interface to create Windows, Gates coolly replied that they both had a rich neighbor named Xerox, and Microsoft simply broke in to steal the television after Apple had already taken it. Despite the phenomenal launch, the celebration was tragically short-lived. By late 1984, the reality of the Macintosh's high price tag, artificially inflated to $2,495 by new CEO John Sculley to cover massive marketing expenses, and its severe lack of software caused sales to plummet. As the personal computer market descended into a slump, Steve Jobs refused to acknowledge the slowing sales, creating a massive rift between his audacious visions of world domination and corporate reality. His relationship with John Sculley soured dramatically as Jobs became increasingly erratic and difficult to work with. Believing Steve to be an impediment to saving the company, the Apple board of directors ultimately sided with Sculley, stripping Steve of his operational authority in May 1985. The ouster of their visionary leader crushed the spirit of the original team. Steve retreated to his massive, unfurnished Woodside mansion, inconsolable and deeply depressed about what he viewed as an ultimate betrayal. For the brilliant, rebellious engineers who had poured their lives into the Macintosh, the magic was gone. Frustrated by bureaucratic obstacles, stifling management, and the loss of their creative sanctuary, key figures like Burrell Smith and Andy Hertzfeld resigned. The tight-knit band of pirates dissolved into Silicon Valley legend, but their messianic fervor, artistic pride, and unprecedented technical wizardry were forever immortalized in the spirit of the machine that fundamentally changed the world.